Thank you for joining us today for this RenWeb sponsored webinar. We're pleased to have with us today Harry Rulin, who is the chairman of the board and co-founder and chief executive officer of Firestorm. He's going to be making the presentation. You can follow us, as always, at the hashtag Crisis Coach for this session, and please be our friend at Firestorm Solutions and join us on Twitter at Firestorm Sol, S-O-L. As always, Firestorm transfers crisis into value. Firestorm empowers you to manage risks and crises. We're always going to have risks and crises. That's how we handle them. Firestorm has expertise in crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Before I make the disclaimer, I'm going to make a little bit of information about the session. As is usual, all of the participants are on mute. Should you have any questions, please use the built-in question facility of GoToWebinar. We are recording this session. We will try to get to any of the questions that you may have during the session. If not, we'll get to them definitely after. Our presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. The work product provided by Firestorm must be read in conjunction with all guidance given by national, regional, local authorities, as well as your school's personal counsel. Moreover, the information is not to be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. RenWeb is the co-sponsor of this particular series. This is, I believe, the fourth in the series, Crisis Coach Webinar Series. Today we're going to be discussing time, the urgency, when it matters most. You're able to go to firestorm.com to watch past webinars and to register for future webinars. And we're pleased to have today Jacqueline Day, who's the Communication Marketing Manager for RenWeb. Jacqueline, would you like to advertise yourself there?
Hi, yes. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Day, and on behalf of RenWeb, I'm so happy to welcome you to this value-added webinar today. We're so pleased to be working with Firestorm Solutions on this important webinar series. It's a great topic, and we hope that you find a lot of important information and hopefully some great crisis management solutions today, and we're happy to have you. Thanks so much for joining.
Good. Pleased to have you with us, Jacqueline. RenWeb.
Thank you for having me.
I presume that you are all familiar with RenWeb. It is a marvelous system for getting student information, and Firestorm deeply appreciates the cooperation and the technical expertise that RenWeb has. I'd like to turn the time over now and introduce Harry Rulin, who is the Chief Executive Officer, Chairman of the Board, and co-founder of Firestorm Solutions. Harry has an extensive experience with crisis management, corporate management. He is an attorney by profession and experience of a senior level corporate officer in several corporations. Harry, on to you.
Well, Bill, thank you very much, and Jacqueline, thanks for being on the call. I'm excited about today's topic because, we're going to talk about time. And one of the biggest issues in managing a crisis, as any of you who have been involved in a crisis, you know that things accelerate very quickly. And one of the things that happens is we all wind up saying afterwards, God, if I had only had more time, or if I could turn the clock back. Well, one of the things that proper planning, doing vulnerability and threat analysis, doing the kind of work that I know all of you are focused on, it's giving you more time, and it's really enabling you in some ways to turn that clock back. So before we get started with today's presentation, we always do an update before as part of the webinar series, and I'd like to talk about some of the headlines that have been recently in the press, and also to talk about some things that I haven't had the chance to change this slide. So as you all know, there was another shooting that took place in Pennsylvania yesterday at a school. One of the things that's happening is that school violence is accelerating at an accelerating rate. So we have already had more school shootings and violent events in the first 3 years of this decade, so from 2010 to now, than we have had in any previous decade in total. And I am making the guess, this is my personal opinion, that by the end of 2020, so in this decade, we will wind up having had more school shootings and violent events than in all previous decades in total. And I think as school administrators, as people who are involved in the communities and in keeping our students, faculty, and staff safe, everyone on this call needs to understand that the paradigm is shifting. There are things happening that are major changes in the way our culture exists. And I know that a lot of the schools that are on this call, I've had the wonderful opportunity to speak to many of the RenWeb schools over the last several weeks, one-on-one, and I know many of you, your schools are small, they're private, you don't necessarily feel that you're exposed to some of these situations. I think an important thing to keep in mind is, regardless of how wonderful the members of your particular school community might be, there are always situations that occur where things wind up coming into your school that were not necessarily part of your school community. So, you know, strangers that come in. We recently this week in the school system here in Colorado had a stranger on campus with a gun. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that situation because it was very interesting. You know, one of the things that happens in any situation that's out of the ordinary, especially when it involves children and guns, there's a lot of panic that happens. And in this particular situation, the substitute teacher could not remember how to dial 911. And I'm not saying that there was a special system, that in some way she needed to dial a 9 first or anything like that, as some of you have heard me talk about in other presentations. She literally was so panicked she couldn't remember 911. Now, I thought it raises an important issue. We have, of course, people within our schools of varying ages, our faculty and our staff. Some of them are young, some of them, like myself, are a little bit older. And while 911 are numbers that are embedded in the minds of certainly our children and any of the younger people, those of us who didn't grow up with 911 in our vernacular are having to incorporate that in, and it's not necessarily something that automatically happens. So when we talk to you about training, education, constant test exercises, you know, constantly doing things to make sure that preparedness is part of your school culture, this is a really interesting example of how some of those things can go wrong. Similarly, we had a school that we were working with this week who they had a young man, a student, who had a death list of the kids and the faculty at his school that he wanted to, what's going on with my system here today? That was a situation that needed to be addressed. So I want to talk to you all a little bit more about that as we go on as well, but I am for some reason having computer difficulties at the moment. So if you can just bear with me for a second. I don't know. Let's see, resume slideshow. Yeah, that's where we need it to be. Okay, so you know, today we're going to talk a bit about the different attributes of a crisis, how time influences all of them. So one of the things you'll see during a crisis is that there's an escalating flow of events. Things start coming at you, and if you've got the proper planning in place, you've got the education, the training, while they come at you very rapidly, you're prepared to deal with them. You know what to do in any given situation. One of the things that's absolutely in almost every crisis we've ever dealt with, you have insufficient information. You always have inaccurate information. To some degree, most of the information that you'll get in a crisis is inaccurate for one reason or another. Very often it's because the person who's giving it to you or the person they got it from is very emotional. And when emotion gets involved with information, instead of just getting facts, you wind up getting a lot of opinion. And that can create a huge problem. You also get, of course, a lot of scrutiny, the loss of command and control. All of these things have to do with training, with education, with everybody knowing what's my role, what am I supposed to be doing. And they all wind up creating time problems because situations which need to be resolved rapidly and basically as a matter of course wind up taking up time. And you've all seen before in some of my presentations that I use a calendar and a clock. You know, like right now, for example, when we're not having an emergency, we can schedule a meeting. We can talk about what our emergency response plan, our crisis management plan, how we're going to deal with different situations. And we can do that in a very civilized and organized fashion because we are on the calendar. Once a situation occurs, once we're in the midst of a crisis, we're on the clock. And when you're on the clock, there's only a certain amount of seconds or minutes to accomplish a given task. And if you have to try to do that and plan for it in that environment, it's almost impossible to do. And when seconds count, sometimes the task will take minutes. And it can have a very serious impact on your school, on your students, on safety, on your brand and reputation. So all of those things become very important. So one of the things you hear Firestorm harping on and that we really want you guys to think about is the process. Doing that predictive work up front, knowing what can go wrong, taking the time to really analyze what are my vulnerabilities and threats, what are the impacts on my school. Again, taking the time to develop the policies, the process, and the procedure, to then do the training, the education, the monitoring, all of the controls, building that comprehensive box that we refer to as your program framework, and then making sure all of the pieces that are plugged into that program framework are interconnected with one another so that when you do trigger your emergency response plan and your crisis management team takes over at your emergency operations center, wherever that might be on your given campus, that all of the communications that flow do so in a fashion where they save you time, they gain you time, they give you the things that you need in order to perform in any kind of adverse situation. So I know a lot of the schools that are on this call today are faced with weather-related emergencies. So if your tornado plan, for example, isn't fully fleshed out, if you haven't gone through all the training and the education, the communications, all those things, as you can imagine, in some of those weather-related situations, seconds really count and can mean the difference between a disastrous event and one which really is handled well, and while we may incur physical property damage, we've saved all of our people. And of course, that's life safety is our first and primary goal in many of these situations. This slide looks very jumbled, very confused. I think that's an important thing for us to look at, for us to all understand. So many pieces are moving when we're having to manage our time in a crisis. And actually, I'm just going to ask, Bill, can you take your phone off of mute for just 1 second and let me know that these slides are coming through properly, because I'm having some computer issues.
You're doing fine, Harry.
Okay, because for some reason I'm not showing that the slides are actually going out to everybody. So I'm on the time management slide at the moment, and
That is correct.
Okay,
Yep.
beautiful. I just wanted to make sure. So yeah, I think this slide to some degree, to me, points out a lot of the way a crisis feels. So many things going on in so many different directions that you're trying to coordinate all at once. And it's that plan. It's that process that you've gone through where you've done all your predictive work. You've actually planned for all of the detail. You know who you're going to communicate with, how you're going to communicate. You've already pre-mapped those messages so you know what you're going to say, who is authorized to say it. So you're not trying to make those decisions during a crisis. That's going to make all the difference in the world. So again, what I mentioned a few moments ago, the idea of the calendar and the clock. You want to be making these decisions, doing your plans, walking it through with your people while you're on the calendar. You do not want to be on the clock and having to make those decisions, because again, those seconds that really count in an emergency situation, you won't get them and you won't get them back. But you can get them right now, and you can get them back right now if you do that planning, that training, the education, all of those pieces. Build that framework. Know what the preparedness culture for your school is going to be. Then start plugging in all those different modules, your emergency response plan, your crisis response plan, your crisis, and I differentiate those two because emergency response is very often life safety. Crisis management is what comes after that. Similarly, your crisis communications plan, all of your evacuation plans, if you are going to do specific active shooter planning, which I know a lot of the schools are doing, all of those pieces need to be done in advance. They can't possibly be done at the time an incident occurs. So again, your planning process is in fact a time machine. It eliminates confusion. And as everyone knows, we've all seen this in our just day-to-day life. Confusion costs time. So your plan is what gives you back that time. And you really want to focus on gaining back those seconds, gaining back those minutes, because that's what's going to make your plan effective. One of the things I've talked to many of you about is this statement that's at the top of the screen. If you're explaining, you're losing. One of the things you never want to be put in the position to have to do is explain why something occurred or didn't occur during your response process. It's almost impossible to explain because people are going to say, you should have been prepared. You should have known this was going to happen. And having that very detailed predict, plan, perform methodology to everything that you do in going through how you interact with your students, teachers, and employees, knowing that your plans have been customized specifically for your school. Some of the plans that we've had the opportunity to look at for RenWeb schools, some of those plans were put together by people who shared information between schools, which is wonderful. I absolutely think if you can meet with your peers, discuss their plans, learn from them, but you've got to make sure that they've truly been adapted to your school. That the planning effort, that the training, that all of that work is specific for your school, because what I find is a lot of the plans tell you what to do. The real difficult pieces, they don't tell you how to do it. So telling somebody to dial 911 in the event of an emergency is very different than telling them how to do it. This goes back to the issue which I've had with several of the schools recently, that in order to dial 911, I have to first dial 9 to get a dial tone, and then dial 911. Well, if that's going to be the case, there better be very explicit training and instruction. So one of the things we're doing now with the school system that had this problem just last week is we're actually putting a sticker on the bottom of every phone in the school district that says how to dial 911. And I know that that might seem overkill, but we learned in a real-life situation that there was a problem. So that's one of the reasons we encourage all of you to do test exercises. It's one of the reasons that when your plan is never done. Your program, your overall preparedness program is never done. It's what we call continuous improvement. You know, we've created these continuous improvement alliances with several RenWeb schools, and we're looking to do it with everybody, where we're always making incremental steps forward every month. And some schools can afford to do bigger pieces. Some schools, it's very small steps every month, but it's continuous improvement all the time. So one of the things that occurs, as you've all seen this, in even the smallest, not even of crises or disasters, where is it? You know, where did I put my plan? Where did I put this document? How do I find it on the computer? How do I get a hold of Joe Smith? You know, how do I get a hold of the person who has the keys to this particular room? The time to know and find all of those answers is definitely not during a crisis. Having all of those things documented, and remember, when you're putting those things together, I've had the wonderful opportunity to speak to some of you on the phone the past couple of weeks, and you said, oh yeah, I know where that is. Oh yeah, I know where the keys are. I know how to do that. I know how to do this. The one thing that I always point out to everyone who says that is, okay, I'm going to do a test exercise for your school, and you are not available. You are on vacation. You are somewhere else when the situation occurs. Now what's going to happen? Make sure that the answer to that question is that your school is always going to be able to function and implement its plan and have the same level of confidence and information whether you are there or not. And the you doesn't necessarily mean the you who's on this phone call. It's the you that you might be relying on who is the one person, because especially in small schools, we wear a lot of hats. And that person who's wearing all those hats, that institutional knowledge needs to be documented and needs to be shared so that you follow Firestorm. We have a rule 1, 2, 3. And basically, for every one person, there needs to be 2 other people who've been trained in their particular area of expertise. Because one of the things you find in a crisis is either that person is not there for one reason or another, or sometimes that person is actually involved in the crisis. You know, we never want to be put in a situation where any of our people are injured or are in any way incapacitated, but it could very well be that that person is in lockdown. That person is just not available because we've locked down the school and they happen to be in a classroom or somewhere else where we don't have communications access to them. So again, all of this needs to be very clearly documented, and the training and education becomes the key. Again, time, access, accuracy, these are your responsibilities. The issues really get amplified. You know, you can see how this slide is somewhat fuzzy and out of focus. That's what happens during a crisis. Everything goes into hyperdrive, and it's very difficult to try and manage in that environment if you're not used to it. And for the most part, there's very few people in the school environment who get subjected to this kind of thing on a regular basis. So one of the jobs that we try to have someone within the school always be filling is making sure that your people have some exposure. In other words, someone's responsible for doing test exercises, whether it be tabletops, whether it be drills, whether it be an annual type of an event where we actually do put people in an environment where they can get a window into what it feels like to be in a crisis. You know, one of the things we've started doing recently is placing the different types of crises on what we call this business crisis map. So obviously, you can see there are different levels, whether they be acute, severe, chronic, difficult. You know, chronic events are the kind of things that happen long-term, systematic, over time. So knowing the type of events, again, when you do your predictive work, looking at what are the types of things that could occur? What are the things that keep us up at night? You know, I was speaking to a school recently here in the Rocky Mountain area. One of the things that really worries them significantly from a weather-related standpoint is the situation with the possibility of winter blizzard. You know, that could be an acute event. It could be an overwhelming event. Sometimes these things do come up very suddenly as a result of the winds that occur in the Rocky Mountain area. So you've got to decide, where do the different vulnerabilities and threats for your school fall on this business crisis map? Because if what we're trying to do is make sure we've got the time to make appropriate decisions, different types of business crises require different types of responses. So again, I encourage all of you in your predictive work to look at these things very carefully, because the way in which you respond to different crises is going to be different. They're not all the same. This is a wonderful slide. I know when most people see it, they think, oh my goodness, you know, it's confusing. This is very often the way a crisis management plan functions, and the way that you and your people are going to respond to different types of crisis events. So when you design your plans, you know, if you start on the left-hand side of your screen and you look, you know, you have a possible or imminent crisis event. Well, we have a term that we use, which is pre-action. That's the actions that you take before the crisis actually occurs. So you see employee readiness, plan readiness, having done the planning, the training, the simulation exercises, making sure your critical vendors are ready. So for example, we did a very large university plan where one of their critical vendors for their winter storm issues was their fuel oil vendor. They knew that if they had to hunker down and make it through a major winter storm, they needed to have at least 5 days worth of fuel oil, and there were very significant issues with that. So as part of their plan, you know, they went through and dealt with that particular issue. And again, so now as you follow it from the left-hand side of your screen to the right, you can see once onset occurs, the type of things that get triggered. You know, once there's an actual impact, we start doing that impact assessment. We then have to make decisions. Do we activate the plan? Do we stand down? What are the different pieces? As you can imagine, if you were trying to do this in the crisis environment, making all of these decisions, putting all of these things in place, the time crunch that you would feel, the impossibility of getting these things done in an organized and systematic fashion, I mean, you can see what that looks like. The flip side of that is, again, if I go back to my calendar analysis, in other words, if I use my calendar analogy and say, I'm going to schedule all of these pieces, I'm going to plan for them, I'm going to train and test now so that I know what it feels like when the time comes, I've got all the time in the world right now. And that feels good. That's where we want to get all of you to. Again, you don't need to do it all at once. You certainly don't need to do everything on this page. But if we do a continuous improvement, and we follow continuous improvement, we have a continuous improvement alliance between our organizations where we're helping you to get that done, or if you've got the people within your school, I know some of you have a person who's specifically tasked with these functions, as long as they're doing this on a regular basis, I think that's going to make all the difference in the world. And again, what we're trying to ultimately do is gain back time. So what now? What should you be doing? Well, look at your planning process. Is it static or is it dynamic? So again, is it a book that sits on a shelf that when you look over at it, there's a bunch of dust sitting on top of it? That's probably indicative of a problem. Or is it dynamic? Are you regularly taking out your information, sharing it with your people, updating it, doing test exercises? Are you asking the kind of questions that you see on the screen? What should we know? What should we do? What should we say? You know, one of the things that's very important, you want to make sure to communicate clearly with all of your constituents. Do you even know who all of your constituents are? If you have a particular type of emergency, if you need to evacuate your school, do you know how you're going to communicate with parents? Do you know what your plan is for getting the parents and the students back together again if you can't come back to the campus? The reunification plan. So when you look at your plan, is it really actionable? Is it current? Is it easy to use? Have you trained everyone? You see the question there, is it available 24/7? One of the things that happens with crises is that they don't necessarily occur when you want them to. So many schools, for example, have done active shooter training. They do lockdown. They do lockout. They do various types of drills, but they do it with the assumption that it's going to happen when the kids are in class. As you saw yesterday from the shootings that took place in Pennsylvania, sometimes you'll have people who come to the school at drop-off, at pickup time, when the buses are loading, when the kids are out on the playground, when they're out on field trips. All of that kind of thing has to be factored in. If you're in a tornado-prone area and you're taking kids out on a field trip, have you done the training and education of what your tornado plan is going to be when you're in an off-site environment? Have you done any forward-looking work on the location that you're going to? You're going to the local museum. Do you know what their plans are? So again, preparedness is a culture. Always thinking ahead, always trying to gain that time. And again, if you're off-site and you have thought it through, and you know that at the museum, if there's a tornado warning, I'm taking the kids to this particular location, think of how much time that gained you as opposed to the pandemonium that would occur if nobody knew. So again, always thinking ahead, always thinking, how do I gain time? How do I gain back those seconds and minutes that would otherwise be lost? You know, so on the screen now you see preparedness, the cultural issues. How do I manage all of these different pieces? These are just a few of what the plugins, when I was talking earlier about the framework, you know, I know a lot of you have computer departments within your schools. You know, if you think about how we build a computer, you know, we have a box. That box is sort of what we would refer to as your preparedness framework. And if you look at all the pieces, you know, I got to plug in my motherboard and my hard drive. And in order to make the overall unit run, I need all of these pieces. Not only do I need all these pieces, I need all these pieces to talk to one another and work with one another. And the only way that I'm going to get back those precious seconds, those precious minutes, is if I've done them all, I've made sure they all communicate with one another, and I've got a structure in place. And again, I think that the way that that happens is a continuous improvement philosophy at your school. You're always moving your plans forward. You know, one of the things that I really would like to see you all avoid is allowing what's taking place in the media currently, whether it's active shooter or whatever the cause du jour might be, from guiding your activities. Do we all need to be aware of the active shooter issue? Absolutely. Do we all need to factor in weather-related emergencies, natural disasters, those kind of things? Absolutely. But the vulnerabilities and exposures to your school, there are many, and they are significant. All of the things that you see on this screen are things that Firestorm has dealt with some of the people on this call, as well as schools across the country. And your vulnerability and threat list that you come up with for your school is going to be what you develop your planning around. Your culture is going to be built around the work that you do. And does every school need to be aware of bullying and cyberbullying? Absolutely. I mean, it is probably the leading issue for schools nationwide, because of the school violence events that occur, the vast majority of those who perpetrate them indicate that they felt bullied in one way or another in the school environment. So again, by having those policies in place, by doing the training and education, that's how you're going to hopefully prevent those things from ever occurring. And if they do ever occur, you're going to be able to respond more accurately, more rapidly, and in a more successful fashion. You know, one of the things that you probably can hear from my tone and from the situations that you may have all responded to, or that we've certainly been involved in, is that crises escalate. You know, things start out very often at one level, and then they change over time. And again, going back to that issue of time, you know, if you have an event occur, whether it be a natural disaster, whether it be a school violence event, whether it be a situation with a medical emergency on your campus, things tend to grow over time. One of the things that happens, especially in today's environment, is that every person who is carrying a cell phone is a publisher. They can publish to YouTube, they can publish to Facebook, they can publish to other things. The media gets involved. So I don't know how many of you saw some of the Facebook and Twitter posts that happened yesterday during the crisis that was going on at the school in Pennsylvania. But what that has done is change the environment for all of us, because the escalation that occurs when the press gets involved, and the press is, not only are the students and the faculty communicating outside of the school while these emergencies are going on, but the press is communicating with those people during the crises. So that has to get factored into your overall program and your training with your people as you go forward. So again, I think about how and when your various plans get activated. What are the triggers? And it's extremely important, going back to the issue of not just what to do, but how to do it. How do you trigger your emergency response plan? When does your crisis management plan get triggered? Who has the ability to do that? All those issues, the who, what, when, where, and why, all become very important questions that are easy to answer now. They're easy to sit in a conference room and go through it and everybody understand what their roles are and get trained and get educated. They're very difficult to decide and very difficult to implement if you're trying to do it in a crisis environment. You know, one of the things that's so critical is crisis communications. Trying to develop your messaging and decide who you're going to deliver it to and who's going to deliver it during a crisis is almost impossible. It's really, really difficult because you're trying to develop messages while your emotions are running high and while you feel that incredible time pressure. Because as we all know, I mean, if you've ever had to get up in front of a room and give a speech, or if you've ever had to even write a communication, they take time. They take a lot of effort, and you go back and you're always changing words and you're like, oh yeah, you know, this may be misinterpreted, so I probably want to say it differently. You don't get that luxury if you're trying to develop your crisis communications during the crisis. You want those messages pre-formatted. Now, is it possible that the message needs to be adapted or changed or modified? Sure, but we use another expression all the time at Firestorm that it's easier to edit than create. It is much easier to edit a message when you need to use it than it is to attempt to create one in the heat of the moment. And again, it all comes down to time. The brand and reputation of your school relies on your ability to respond effectively and timely. The safety and security of your people may rely on your ability to respond quickly and to communicate quickly. You know, we've had situations where emergencies have occurred at schools, and instead of having a pre-formatted message for crisis communications, someone and again, I say someone because they haven't necessarily authorized a particular individual, gets on the PA system or the radio or the telephone or whatever the communication modality is that you use for your crisis communications, and says something which they wish they had never said. It either comes across poorly, or worse, it delivers a message which is misinterpreted. So again, I can't emphasize enough to all of you that as part of your plan development, as part of the work that you do during that planning phase, the crisis communications is an essential piece to making sure that your plan is actionable and that things go as well as they possibly can. You know, one of the new and emerging risks that we all know, I mean, we see cyberbullying taking place on social media all the time. The amount of information that now takes place and goes back and forth between our students via social media is overwhelming. But what you have to remember, every day our staff gets younger and younger. As new teachers graduate from university and come into our school environment, as we bring in more and more people as time goes on, the use of social media becomes greater and greater and greater. In fact, our families are using it to communicate with one another. They use it to communicate with their kids. And there's a absolute requirement at this point that schools incorporate a social media component into their overall preparedness planning in the school environment. Social media is a wonderful tool for gaining time, for saving time, for communicating, and again, it is a communication modality that everyone needs to be familiar with, needs to be aware of, and needs to understand the exposures that it creates, both positively and negatively. Similarly, communicable illness planning, I've had the great opportunity to speak with several of you on this call who have great communicable illness plans in place. As you all know, the amount of absenteeism, both teachers, students, as well as everyone else in the school community from communicable illness is very significant. But we've also had some schools significantly damaged as a result of communicable illness and not having communicable illness policies, cleaning protocols, all of those things clearly outlined. You know, if your school suddenly has an outbreak of meningitis or drug-resistant tuberculosis or something of that nature, that you did not have in place the appropriate planning, training, education, all the things that we talk about, your response is going to be suboptimal. You're going to, again, attempt to come up with a positive response in an environment where the clock is ticking very quickly. Who you need to communicate with, what needs to be said, how it needs to be said. Do we need to change our cleaning protocols? Do we need alternative space? Do we need to look at so many different issues that can affect the school dramatically that we really just can't do? We don't have the time to do it in that environment. So again, I encourage all of you to look at, during your predictive phase, the vulnerabilities and threats that you feel you need to address. Is communicable illness one of them? I find it hard to believe that there's not some component of communicable illness planning that will take place at every one of your schools, but how much emphasis you place on it. Again, none of the things, no one component, if you don't feel it's appropriate for your school, needs to be concentrated on. So I know that there are many of the schools that I've spoken with who have not incorporated an active shooter plan into their preparedness planning. Now, what they do in those situations, a lot of schools, I know some of you on this call, utilize a all hazards approach where you say that our lockdown, lockout, shelter in place, and evacuation that we use for all hazards will take that into account. That's fine. That's wonderful. If you've done the training, the education, you know how the pieces all work, everyone knows their roles and responsibilities, you are going to do well in almost every situation. And again, that's what it comes down to. It comes down to putting in place all of the pieces, having the framework, knowing what that box looks like that your preparedness culture resides within, and how all of the different components that are within it speak to one another. That's what's going to gain you back that critical time. You know, we've talked a lot about workplace violence. You know, the other thing for schools that you need to remember is, yes, we talk about active shooter. Very often we talk about that in terms of a student doing something on a campus. One of the things I want to remind you of is that workplace violence is one of the leading causes of death for employees. Keep in mind, all of you who are administrators, your teachers, your staff, your maintenance people, that's their workplace. And about 2 people a day in the United States die in the workplace as a result of workplace violence. The FBI estimates that there is now a mass killing, which they quantify as 4 or more victims every 2 weeks in the United States. So workplace violence planning, training, and education as part of your program is, again, one of those things that's going to enable you, it's going to give you back those seconds, those minutes, that time that really counts when situations turn ugly, when situations are really bad. So we talk about key criteria in any plan. You know, how do we make sure that the plans we've got align with best practices, that they are in fact available to everyone all the time, that they are comprehensive, that we are in fact practicing continuous improvement. I mean, all of these different things you see on the screen, I point to the one at the bottom there, 2 up from the bottom, says not just a binder on a shelf. That is such an essential issue. You know, I've walked into schools where we're doing on-site analysis for the school, we're doing site assessment, and we ask about their plans, and somebody points over, oh, there it is. It's that binder there on the shelf. That's not your preparedness plan. That's a binder on the shelf. We need to make sure that it's part of who you are and what you do, the training, the education. I can't stress that enough. I mentioned earlier, you know, that several of the schools on this call, and I know I've talked to many of you about it, this idea of a continuous improvement alliance. We are more than happy to work with you and help move your program forward. For some of you, that's, you know, we're spending a couple hours a month together, and we're making sure that we're providing almost a project management type of function. For others, we're actually doing full-scale planning, training, and education. It really depends on how big a piece you have the time, the physical resources, the financial resources, and others. There's no school that's on this call that doesn't have the ability to move their plan forward on a regular basis. It just needs to become a priority issue. You know, one of the things people ask, well, you know, why are we doing this? Why are we continually improving the plans, processes, and procedures at our school? Well, obviously, we've got very concerned parents. We need to know that our students, faculty, and staff are safe. We also need to know that our school can survive whatever the disruption or crisis is. If you have a major weather-related event, a tornado or whatever else that hits your school, and your school was not prepared, things didn't go well, the reputation and brand are damaged permanently, and that affects the school even if nobody got injured. So very important to think about the preparedness overall and how it affects your school and how it affects your ability to go forward and look as good as possible and have the best possible outcome regardless of what the crisis might be. So one of the things that RenWeb has done for all of its schools, which is a very significant step that's been taken, is to allow access to Firestorm's self-assessment the reason we call it a self-assessment, and actually it's done on a, it's called a self-assessment because we're not coming out to your school and actually assessing the issues ourselves. What we're doing is we're getting on the phone with all of you and walking through a series of questions, about 50 questions. It takes about an hour. And we're hearing from you where your school is at in terms of a variety of preparedness issues. We'll talk about the actual framework that you may or may not have for your overall preparedness program. We'll ask you about security. We'll ask you about physical layout of your campus, all kinds of things which will enable us to then produce a report for you which tells you where you are as relates to best practices based on the information that you gave. Normally this is something that we charge for, but RenWeb has underwritten this on your behalf. I have done numerous of these assessments over the last several weeks with RenWeb customers. It has been wonderful. I mean, you guys are all in varying stages of preparedness, but everybody wants to move forward in a positive fashion, and everybody is moving forward in a positive fashion. So it's been great for me. I've learned a lot from all of you, and I look forward to doing more of these assessments for everybody going forward. Again, just having this assessment done, the report that comes from it, I guarantee will gain you back time. You know, going back to sort of the theme of today's webinar, there are going to be things you learn from your assessment report, changes that you can make, upgrades to your current process and procedure that are going to make your school safer, more efficient, better communicators, all of those things. And again, I encourage every school to take advantage of the self-assessment. You can arrange for that by speaking to the folks at RenWeb. You can contact us directly. I know that someone will reach out for all of you to try and see if you'd like to schedule this, but I very much encourage it because it's something that RenWeb has done on behalf of its clients, and I really encourage all of you to take advantage of that. Another thing that I very much want to, again, emphasize to all of you is that idea of predict, plan, perform. The predictive work up front is so important. One of the things you have to, the discipline that I really would love for you to take away from these webinars is don't allow yourself to jump from predict to perform. We all see a problem, we hear a problem, we understand a problem, and we want to fix it. And going through the discipline of the process of predicting the vulnerability, developing a detailed plan, doing the training, the education, and everything else around it so that you know you have a really valid response is important. And it's, again, it's a discipline. I want to thank RenWeb. Jacqueline, very much thank you for being on the call today. We've got a little bit of time left, so Bill, if I would open the floor to questions. I know everybody, if you want to submit a question, you do. There's a little box in your on your screen that you can submit a question. So Bill, do we have any questions?
We do not yet. There have been some people wanting to know how to get a copy of the slide deck. You will be getting a communication from the GoToWebinar people. You can simply respond to that and say, please send a copy of the slides, and we'll take care of that. There was another person who had already done a self-assessment, and they were wondering, you know, the timing on getting the report.
Typically, it takes us about 4 or 5 days to produce the report. Sometimes we can do it quicker. So, for example, we had a school this past week who needed it for a board meeting. They said, could they get it the next day? The answer is, of course. I mean, if we need to put it together quickly. The other thing that I really want to emphasize to everybody is the assessment that we do and the report that we put together is designed to help you. We will never put anything in a report that is going to make you look bad, and we will discuss with you before we deliver you the report what the report says, and if there's anything in it that you disagree misunderstood something, or that you would prefer just not to have in writing. We have had schools, for one reason or another, decide that they wanted a certain paragraph changed or written in a certain way because we misunderstood something. That's absolutely, not only is it important to us, it's a requirement. I think you need to make sure that this report accurately reflects who you are and where you are in the preparedness process.
Yeah. And here's some questions that have come in. Seems like a full-time job overwhelming for a small team of people who have other jobs at the school.
That is the best question. That is the best statement and the best question that somebody could have raised, because you're absolutely correct. Everyone at your school has a day job, probably not preparedness. Some schools are big enough they actually do have a person who's responsible for this, but that's the whole concept behind what our continuous improvement alliance is. Basically, if you don't have a person responsible for this, then it gets pushed to the back burner. And it in fact does become just a binder sitting on a shelf. In addition, this is what we do all day, every day. So for you to reinvent that wheel, to try and design a specific kind of plan or program, makes no sense. First of all, we've already got it. Second of all, we're keeping it up to date. We're keeping it up to best practices standard every day. So again, whether you can afford and have the time and the resources to spend 10 hours a month, 20 hours a month, 2 hours a month, whatever it is, the whole idea is that you be always moving forward. And you're right, it can feel overwhelming, but we can very much assist in making it not feel that way, because this is our day job. This is what we do.
Here's another question that says, do you have a suggested social media risk plan and communicable illness plan templates?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We can help in numerous ways with any component that you would plug into your framework. So in other words, if you need a social media plan, if you need a workplace violence plan, you need whatever the component is, we can help you either by giving you the well, for example, in the case of workplace violence, we have a very, very detailed workplace violence toolkit that you can then build your workplace violence plan from. We can help you with templates so that you can then start to flesh out the template. One of the things that we would certainly recommend in those situations is engage us in a small project kind of environment. So in other words, enter into a continuous improvement alliance just for those pieces you need, and we can make sure, again, to help you manage that project, ask you the questions that you're going to need to be asked so that you can get those projects on track. Can we just give you the templates? Absolutely. You just would have to go back and ask yourself, do we have the time, the people, the resources, the knowledge to do this on our own? But the answer to the question is yes, we can help you in any way that you need help.
Great. Now we're getting to the top of the hour, Harry. Jacqueline, any last comments you would like to make?
No last comments. Just wanted to again thank everyone for attending, and this was really great. And I love learning this information too. So thank you, everyone at Firestorm. We really appreciate it.
Well, we really appreciate working with RenWeb. And again, I've had so many wonderful conversations over the last several weeks with RenWeb schools. So I look forward to having a lot more of them. And again, I would encourage all of you, if you've got a question, reach out. We're not going to charge you to answer it. We'd love to talk to you. We'd love to communicate with you. You know, RenWeb has put this alliance together between the organizations, and we're here to help. Yeah, would we love to have you all as clients? Absolutely. But that's in no way going to foreclose us from giving you information that's going to help make your students, faculty, and staff safer and, you know, make your program more effective.
Right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We appreciate your participation. Thank you, Harry, for guiding the discussion and for sharing your knowledge about this subject.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And again, I apologize for the computer I don't know what was going on, but I'm glad everybody was able to see. And I look forward to the next webinar that we all do together. And I know I'll talk to some of you. I've already got calls set up with some of you for this week, and I look forward to that. So thanks again, Bill and Jacqueline, and we'll all talk again soon.